Hello and welcome to this special session where I'm going to be analysing the previous 5 lessons and the key elements within each of those sessions. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I'll make sure I'll put a link in the description to, wherever you're watching this so that you can go ahead and catch up and get back into the swing of things so that I can actually look in more detail at the 5 pillars of nymphing technique that I've pulled out. And it's not that these are the only 5 things that you should or could be doing in your nymphing. It's just that these are really tried and tested factors that when you apply them, even if you just apply them one at a time, they're pretty much guaranteed to improve your results on stream. So they really are fundamental and really important elements that you need to be incorporating into your own fishing. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump into the slide view just here. And yes, as you can see, I've named it why these 5 pillars of nymphing. So what justifies my inclusion of these techniques and why the elements of them actually work and what they do for you. And ultimately what we're working towards is building a system that can actually help you get better results on stream. One of the first criterion that, basically to be included in this list at all, every one of these 5 pillars has to work just as a standalone technique. It needs to work just in its own right. So it's not good enough to only be sort of make a small difference if it's combined, applied in combination with a whole suite of other things. So that's great because you get that kind of instant improvement that I was talking about before. So it needs to have that complete standalone effectiveness. And, I've been fortunate enough to use these techniques and have some, wonderful days on stream, including some great memories from last summer, pre-lockdown, which is obviously uppermost in everybody's mind as I'm recording this right now. But just as an example, beautiful wild trout. I was fortunate enough to catch with some good friends, Kim and Adrian. We spent the day using largely French nymphing techniques. And I spent a while fishing a streamer on a French leader as well. But most of the day and for most of the fish, including this one, French nymphing techniques were the order of the day. And applying these fundamental principles, really sort of helped to ensure that we had the best chance of success on that day and many others. Again, another local stream to me, you can see the small, simple, impressionistic nymph pattern in the mouth of another lovely wild fish. Not an enormous fish, but very, very memorable. And, it's I don't want to say it's typical of or kind of predictable so much, but actually, using and applying these approaches to your fishing, it definitely does set you up for the best chances of success. And whether the conditions favour you or not, that's a different sort of story. But putting yourself in the best possible position to have some of these really memorable encounters with fantastic wild fish like this. And it's not only, on my home turf that these sort of techniques work. This is a photo. It's a little bit older than some of the images perhaps that you'll see in these sessions, but this is actually taken on the, well, you'd probably call it the home of shortline Czech nymphing. It's the Tepla Vltava in Czech Republic, or Czechia as it is now referred to. But this actual river and the section of river, it's where most of the photographs from Karel Krivanovich's Czech Nymphing and Other Related Methods book, which is something you might have seen. This is where a lot of the photographs in that book were taken. And I'm certainly applying these kind of fundamental principles to some very enjoyable and memorable effect over several trips to that part of the world as well. Some great memories from there. And of course, there's the obligatory big fish grip and grin shot, and it might not be quite my heaviest and grayling, but it's certainly one of the most handsome fish that I can remember taking. And obviously, this was put back in the river straight after the photograph was taken. It was a little bit lighter than my heaviest grayling, but I think it was still longer than my heaviest grayling, if that makes sense. I think this is a more sort of well-proportioned, sort of, nice, hefty, but sort of sleek fish. And yeah, again, it's something that I benefited from in one of the actual lessons that we're going to be analysing. One of the principles of fishing, exactly on the seam of water was absolutely critical to catching this fish. It's a basic fundamental, and as I say, it's helped me to have some of these wonderful memories that I can just share with you briefly here. I'm not going to labour this too long, because obviously, I want you to be getting into having your own experiences and creating your own memorable trips on stream. But it's just really to impress upon you that these things are tried and tested, and they definitely have stood the test of time as well. That's great. It's all fantastic that each of these things works individually, but is that it? Is that all that there is to it? So what I want to do is have a more detailed look at some of the reasons that these things and these elements, the 5 pillars, if you like, what they help, what they actually do for you and how they help you to have better success on stream, and to really dig into that a little bit more deeply than in the previous lessons, which, as I say, if you've not had a chance to catch up on yet, please feel free to go back, sign up and get up to speed on those. It'll really sort of help to make more sense of the stuff that goes on in this session. But for the first one that I want to look at, this first pillar number 1, it's this proactive drift management. And I've got a particular story that I will pick up on in a minute or two with Mauricio and the windscreen wiper. But talking about the windscreen wiper, this is what I actually mean. When you're short line nymphing, and even actually fishing with a slightly longer line as well, if you continue tracking around, so as if your rod was kind of like the long hand on an analog clock face and sort of sweeping around that clock, it doesn't actually give you the greatest presentation in the world. In fact, it creates several problems, not least of which, if you're actually fishing for grayling, it's not brilliant, because they tend to only really like flies that are traveling in line with the current to a large degree. But it's not only that, because you may already be familiar with the kind of the pulley wheel effect that you can get if you're not tracking your nymphs very well, and sort of keeping pace with them properly. And what I mean by that is that you can get this sort of pulley wheel effect where if my hand is the current and that's dragging my line downstream, if you've got this sort of loop effect where your tracking is wrong, if you notice the end of that the piece of line here, if this hand is the current and this is moving downstream, I'm not moving this hand, the fact that this tail actually catches up when I move this downstream like that, it must mean that this end of the line is actually moving faster than the pace of the current itself. So in fishing terms, if this was the fly on this end, as that pulley wheel develops and as it moves downstream, it means that you're whisking the flies much more quickly than the pace of the current. And that can apply laterally as well. It doesn't have to be just vertically. That can apply in a lateral plane as well. So that's it's something that you can get into trouble with if you're sort of have this kind of windscreen wiper style tracking as well. It's certainly something that will amplify and exaggerate that impact. So it's something that, if possible, you want to avoid it. How do you avoid it? The easiest way to try and describe it is almost like having an extendable, thinking of your body as an extendable telescopic extension to your rod. So as your flies are coming down the stream, you're reaching out further and maintaining that straight line path of the nymphs as they travel through the water as far as possible. Now, at some point, you are going to run out of arm. So there is a limit to, the length of that straight line drift. But at that point, it's where you either, use your mandatory hook set motion to check if there's a fish there, turn that into a back cast if you want to redeliver the nymphs, or you can allow them to tuck underneath. You can allow the flies to tuck underneath and fish downstream of your rod as well, and that's a slightly more advanced technique. But the basic thing is that you need to try and keep that path of the drift as straight as possible. And a wonderful illustration of that, I'll never forget it. It was a coaching event in Italy, and I had a little bit of one-on-one with Mauricio, good angler, great fly dresser, if I put my teeth in, great fly dresser, and a good solid angler. But he was covering a pod of fairly active, was a mixture of small brown trout and brook trout, and one or two grayling in there as well, on a river in Italy. And he was having fish just coming to his fly towards the end of his drift, but he was either, they were either missing the fly, or he was getting a very light hook set. So this has happened 2 or 3 times, and he's getting quite frustrated with it. And what I was able to do, because I could see from a third person perspective what was going on, which is always a great advantage, what I had Maurizio do was basically just put his lead leg, his front leg, take a step forward off the bank fractionally. So his front leg was actually just positioned in the margin, and sort of through a combination of sign language and a bit of pidgin Italian and pidgin English, just got across the point to him that as that part of the drift was coming into the real sweet spot of the pool, he needed to kind of extend his whole body out and lean over that front leg, keep that drift nice and straight. And he was able to do that. And on the very next cast, he hooked up on the fish. And I'll never forget the size of the grin on his face as he kind of set the hook and got that fish to hand. And I kind of left him to it, and I could see him playing several fish after that as well. So just, it's a really good instance of where applying that basic fundamental technique, getting it really nailed down, it makes all the difference in the world. So again, that's possibly why this is the first one up in this sequence of 5 pillars. So let's skip back in and carry on through. The next lesson that you may recall, if you've taken that session on your emails, tutorials, the idea of the Flexi Grid, which is, I've seen people kind of say, oh yeah, it's just like gridding, it's just a thing, but it's a simple kind of 1, 2, 3 basic thing. The core element to it is the flexibility of it. So it's not just a kind of the fixed dimensions of each cell in the grid. So that's why this kind of slightly wonky looking diagram where the squares are all different sizes and they're not nowhere near square at all. But that is very, very deliberate. It's not just that I'm a terrible artist. It is that the length of the drift in each cell is determined by the time on the water and not by just the distance. So that's why it's a 3 to 5 second drift, and the measurement is in time and not just in distance. And that's why it's a flexi grid. It's because the length of the side of those cells depends on how fast the current is in that particular area. The other key element to it, which is super, super important, it's something that I'll get onto in the next session, the next sort of webinar, and that is not showing yourself or your fishing gear to the fish before it's seen the fly. So it's that idea of the sequencing of how you present the fly in each of those cells of the grid. Because as you can see, there's a simple thing there, the shadow on the water there, particularly on a short line, you may catch the fish in that top cell, but you've kind of blown your chances at the other 2 potential fish in the 2 cells just downstream of it. And I'll get a little bit more in depth and in detail with the biology of or at least the biological basis and how that kind of helped me kind of build some of these or solidify some of the understanding for these techniques in my own fishing, and to pass that on to you so you can use it for yourself as well. The third pillar is, it's something you see an awful lot of. It's a piece of advice that you're forever being given, and is, you must learn to read the water so that you can put your flies to where the fish are. And it's very true, but you do need some practical guidance on how to actually do that. It's not just good enough to say, you must read the water. So that's why in that lesson, I took a little bit of time in dissecting some of the reasons why fish might choose to lie in certain positions under certain conditions that you find on stream at a given time. And the more that you get into some of these techniques where you can deliver the flies very accurately and control their presentation very precisely, the more opportunities you'll see and start to pick up on and start to take advantage of. Going back to that nice big grayling in the opening sort of section of photos, personal photos from my album, that was one of these instances where getting the flies exactly running down the seam between the faster and the slower water was absolutely critical. It's that joint, that interface between those two contrasting conditions. Either side of that, as I'd proven, because I'd gone up through that section and failed to catch that fish not 5 minutes earlier. And with a bit more encouragement from Tim, my colleague and friend from the Wild Trout Trust, who's water I was fishing at the time, just encouraged me to kind of, get back to, take some of my own medicine, if you will, get back to some of those fundamentals and make sure that I fished that seam very carefully and very fastidiously. So I'd been a couple of inches either side of the real sweet spot. The next pass up on that sweet spot produced that fish, and it also produced another 2 fish, not quite as big as that first one, but again, those were 3 fish that if I'd have not paid real attention to putting my flies to exactly where the fish were, I wouldn't have had those memorable captures. It's not like bait fishing. We can't draw the fish to ourselves to the same degree. There's things we can do to increase the sphere, the range of the influence of those flies, but we must first still understand where the fish are so that we can put ourselves and our flies in front of those fish or within the vulnerable zone where those fish can actually come and take those flies. So that it's clearly a fundamental thing, and that is the reason why it's included within those bonus tutorials. Because it's one of the things that will make the biggest difference to your fishing straight away, instantly. As in my own example there, the difference that there was only minutes apart. Applying that properly just had the result that I was after in the first place. So there's a clear reason for including this, and it's an obvious pillar to have within our short list of 5 essential pillars. The other thing to note about it is that that grid approach, it's knowing where to then apply that in the wider scheme. So you don't just kind of plonk it down across the entire pool and then fish everything with the same intensity. You can do that if you're absolutely researching, completely scientifically exactly where each of the fish are in a particular section of water. But ideally what you want to be doing if you're out for a pleasure fishing, or certainly if you're out to kind of maximize the number of fish that you're catching, maybe you're in a competition, you need to have a good clue on where the high percentage areas to put those grids are, so that you're not sort of taking too much time up fishing your flies through unproductive water. And that's something that you build up over time. It's a great one to have in mind as you're going forward and continuing to develop your fishing as well. So yeah, don't just be restricted in sort of thinking that the grid just lies over the entire river. The idea is that you have several grids that you place in the spots, whereas over time you build up the experience to know where the high percentage areas are. The 4th pillar, it's one that I'll certainly, this is not the last you'll hear of this one, but I don't want you to get too worried. In fact, I'm going to come full screen here. Don't get too worried and think that this is too much kind of fluffy woo-woo sort of stuff. It's genuinely one of the things that will give you the best improvement, the best bang for your buck is just tweaking your mindset to, instead of being frustrated and angry when something doesn't go perfectly right first time, if you can always stay curious about it, it means that you're much less vulnerable to becoming frustrated, because it's a much different feeling to think, oh, I wonder why that happened. I wonder why that didn't work, rather than like, this isn't working. So actually maintaining a genuine curiosity and always being willing and happy to learn something new, that's huge, because it creates the ability within yourself to actually improve, which is just a massive advantage. So I would say always get and then work hard to keep a curious mindset. And I'm fond of quoting this dude. It's a bloke called Epictetus, Greek philosopher. And one of the many things that are worthwhile that he said was that it's impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows. And this is something that I see all the time in internet forums or on Facebook or just in conversation in the pub, whatever it is. You might be talking about a particular element within, a style of fishing, or you might just be talking about a method of fishing. And you'll often see people fighting and almost tripping over themselves to say that, oh yeah, that's just, and like that, those words, that's just, looking to reduce it to something that's sort of smaller than the idea that you're trying to talk about. It's a real red flag to sort of, basically, the next thing that comes out of that person's mouth is probably going to be justifying stagnation, just staying where they are in their own state of knowledge and not actually being curious about, well, maybe there's an element to that I could pick from that, and it might be something that's worthwhile in my fishing. So the classic thing is like, oh, it's just high, French nymphing is just high sticking, or Polish nymphing, my granddad was doing that in, back in the 50s, and it's no blah 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 blah. Okay, I'm still curious about those other things that those other people were doing, but what I don't want to do is just safely put that other idea in a box and just assume that it's not actually useful at all without really looking at it, because there's a good chance if something's got a name that it's been retained after lots and lots of other kind of experiments and alternatives have been tried. So if it's good enough to have been given a name, it's probably good enough to deserve some attention from you, and it probably has the potential to increase your understanding, your enjoyment, and your success on stream. But do watch out for that thing of, you might get one sentence into a description of something and somebody's like, oh yeah, I know that, it's just like blah, and already stop listening, which, okay, it's no skin off your nose or my nose, if you're finding some more value out of the thing that you're talking about, but it does stop people who have that mentality and that mindset from really getting the best benefits, the best value out of the stuff that's out there. And, I'm far more keen to have discussions and get stuff out where we can talk about it and actually collectively improve knowledge than just to sort of like settle for what I already know and just stay sort of stagnant. So it's selfish of me because I want to discuss stuff and learn stuff from everybody, anybody that I can, I'll try and get knowledge from. Doesn't always sit easy with the ego, and it often, again, it's a mindset thing of staying curious instead of getting defensive. But yeah, I can't really overemphasize how important it is to just be open to the fact that stuff might be useful and interesting, even if you've never heard of it before. So that's a huge one for me, certainly. And it's when I've been able to do it properly and kind of master that sort of urge to sort of dismiss something because it's weird or strange or new, I've always benefited from it. Again, I've tried to take my own medicine as much as possible on this. So in the email tutorials, you'll have seen that I analyze myself over a period of years and compare and contrast sort of my own performance on stream in a particular discipline, warts and all, just kind of like ruthlessly analyzing it. And, I'm happy to say that it's fairly easy to see that there was an improvement between the first piece of footage that I analysed of myself and the second one, a few years after that. I'm also happy to say that I think that if I was to do the same exercise again today with more water under the bridge and more experience, that you'd see another improvement. It's not that I've just sort of been happy to stop at that one spot and that one sort of comfort zone and just settle for that. I've continually tried to add and understand more things, and I'd say I'd certainly enjoyed my fishing a great deal more because of that. So yeah, it does really come down to just mastering that first instinct, which is to kind of say, oh yeah, I know that, or I'm not interested in that, or whatever it is. Just be a bit curious, and it really does open up so many doors to you that I really can't say sing the praises of this approach highly enough. It's just a massive boost to your own chances of success. The fifth one, it almost ties in to that previous point, really, and it is particularly, I don't know if it's a Western thing, it's certainly a British thing, but the idea that the basics are just for beginners and it's kind of beneath you, and once you've got through your first year of fishing or something like that, it's quite seductive, but it's also a really bad mistake, because genuinely, somebody who is an absolute maestro, a complete master of something, is someone who can do the basics, but do them flawlessly every time without thinking. Because when that flawless fundamental skill set is there, that frees up the headspace for you to be more creative and to improvise and to do more advanced things if you want to. But at the end of it all, it's just doing those key elements in whatever sphere of activity you're talking about, whether you're a concert pianist, a footballer, or whatever it is. In fishing, the same thing is absolutely true. True mastery is just doing the absolute fundamental skills, but doing them perfectly. So it's the stuff that is easily overlooked and it's easily dismissed, particularly by people who are actually kind of like intermediate and better. You can quite easily forget that you sort of look at something and it's got a sort of like a 101 sort of tag on something, and you're immediately sort of scrolling past it to try and find the next most advanced thing. It could well be a mistake, because getting those basics down is really what it's all about. A lot of the ideas that I'm talking about, there's a great book if you enjoy sort of reading up on this sort of stuff, Practice Perfect. I can save you the too long didn't read version of it that I want to flag up in this particular bit, is that practice makes permanent rather than makes perfect. Practice only makes perfect if the skills that you are repeatedly doing over and over again are good form. So you're doing the skills perfectly as you practice them. So there's two things going on there. There's the mindset thing where you're not sort of shutting your mind and closing your mind off because something is beneath you. So actually being open to learning it, which ties into that previous pillar of nymphing, pillar number 4 in this particular sequence. But also it is about concentrating on taking action and making sure that what you are physically doing is ingraining good form, good technique, and then the results will flow from that. There's a great saying that, if you've got a great process and you follow that process, in sport, for example, the scoreboard will take care of itself. So you don't need to be focusing on the result, you're focusing on the process that you're using. And then if you've got that down really well, the actual outcome of that will just take care of itself. So there's lots of things wrapped up in this, actually. There's the element of making sure that you've got a good grounding, a good understanding, good access to material that show you sound fundamentals. But the more important thing is making sure that you actually put those into action, because none of the things that we talk about, if you don't use them, none of them can help you. And they don't have to be complicated to be difficult to use, or it feels strange and awkward the first time you do it. So, I mean, a great example is that, there's a simple trick where you take one thumb on one hand and put it up, and the finger on the other. And then if you switch the two and then switch back, it's quite easy to get tangled up, particularly when you sort of start doing it faster like that. Give it a try yourself now and see if you end up with a knot of fingers and thumbs. That's not a complicated maneuver to do. It's not it doesn't take a huge sort of like blackboard full of equations to describe what you have to do there. But doing that for the first time, it takes a bit of practice and it takes a bit of ingraining, and it is those fundamentals that you need to ingrain. So, as I say, none of the stuff that we talk about will work unless you go out on stream and use it. And certainly none of it will work if you don't kind of actually understand what those fundamentals are in the first place. So don't overlook the basics, I think, is the take home from that. And as we got into the email lessons, that fifth one that we did, that introduced the sort of the fundamentals around French nymphing as a system for approaching rivers and for very effectively exploring them and testing different flies out and getting the results that you're looking for. So really, again, this is what I'm working forward towards, and this is something that we'll go on to in the next session, next webinar in this sequence, and that is my realization that taking those 5 elements, those 5 pillars, if you like, the results that you get when you're able to combine them together is actually even greater than the tried and tested and proven results that each one of those things give you anyway. And this may be a completely obscure reference, particularly if you're not from the UK, but as British comedian Harry Hill, one of his catchphrases, you've got to have a system. And in nymphing, it's no exception. Absolutely. The combination of these things into a system is then what gives you the multiplier effect on top of the individual benefits that you're already getting from applying each one of those pillars from the lessons. And so that next session, I'm going to have a look at when and how, for myself, I started to get some really significant improvements in results with nymphing after some initial frustrations, for sure, and we'll talk about that as well. But more importantly, obviously, is by understanding that, you'll be able to shorten your own sort of progress curve if you so desire. On top of that, I'll also go into which one of the 5 pillars is most important and why that is, and throw in some more of the details of the ways that I combined some of my other backgrounds in freshwater biology with the fishing and sort of mixing those two together into that system. So I'd be delighted if you join me on that one. Please don't miss it. And thank you ever so much for joining me on this one. If you've any questions, probably the best thing to do is to hit me up on the Fishing Discoveries Facebook group. It's a group you'll have to join, but if you just go in there and sort of request to join it, we'll be happy to add you in there. It's probably the best way to get an easy, free-flowing discussion going around this sort of stuff. And if it's something that I don't pick up immediately, then either myself or John will sort of maybe pass it between us or whatever it is. So I'd definitely go ahead and do that. And as I say, thanks for joining me on this one, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.